All right. Hey, everybody. We are here to talk about Shinto. This is a Japanese quasi-indigenous religion, at least a religion with deep indigenous roots. Your chapter on this was significantly shorter than chapters on other religions we've read, and especially that we will read. The chapters on Judaism and Christianity in particular, and I think Islam, are very long. Let's talk about the Shinto mythology. This is something we haven't hit on a lot in the other lectures on the other religions, but let's talk a little bit about this. In the beginning, according to Shinto mythology, there was chaos. Now, I'm going to point out that this is a pretty common theme in different mythologies. Now, by the way, when I say mythology, I don't mean to imply that it's false. I mean mythology in the sense of origin story, and that story could be true, right? So don't take that if you're inclined to believe this story. I don't take myself to be saying that you're wrong necessarily. So according to this story, in the beginning there was chaos, right? Now, this is an interesting claim. It's a claim that's common to lots of creation stories. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation story, and I don't know all the details. It's been a while since I've read it. But this is common to that story, and arguably, I might be saying some controversial stuff here, but arguably, this is common to the Genesis narrative in Judaism and Christianity. Remember that in Genesis 1, there's actually a complicated interpretational debate here in terms of interpreting or translating the Hebrew, and there are two different ways to translate it, which make it sound in one case more like this, and in another case less like this. But in the beginning, when God created the world, there was darkness over the face of the deep, right? And so the implication on at least lots of translations, and these are not, crazy translations, these are mainstream translations, is that when God started creating, there was already a deep and there was darkness hovering over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God, the Spirit of God, was hovering over the deep. So there's already stuff there, right? And so chaos and this is actually common to these sorts of creation stories, is that chaos is not, what you might think, right? When I think of chaos, I think of my kids running around and creating chaos. But chaos is disorder, a lack of distinction, lack of order. So it is sort of like if you're familiar with the Genesis narrative, it's sort of like that across these different creation stories. It's not like crazy stuff happening. It's just lack of distinction, lack of features, like a featureless state. There's something there, but it hasn't been kind of organized into different things and stuff, right? So it's just a mass, basically a featureless mass. And what creation does is it takes this stuff that exists before, and think about the Genesis narrative, and it separates light from dark. So you make a distinction, and you start separating the water from the land, and that's making a distinction, right? So there was something there that was kind of featureless, but then after the creation event, or the organizing event, you still have stuff, but now you have two kinds of things which you can name as distinct kinds of things. So the chaos is not as we would think of it. It's sort of like a featureless, distinctionless stuff. And that's common to the Shinto creation story too. And eventually, these kami, this is going to be a word you want to know, these are deities or spirits emerged from the chaos. And the two really important ones for creation were Izanami and Izanagi. And the first one is female and the latter one is male. And these were the cosmic parents who ended up creating the islands of Japan. What happened was they dipped a spear into the water, kind of swirled it around, brought it up. The brine that dripped off formed the islands of Japan. Notice too that this creation story is really kind of primarily focused on Japan, and this is something that your chapter talked about towards the end. Is as a religion, there are lots of features of Shinto that kind of constrain it in terms of its spread, right? In one sense, it's kind of different than the way we think of Islam, the way we think of Christianity. Um, I'm thinking of those two in particular, which are kind of universal religions. They're kind of, I say designed. I don't mean that in a strong sense, but it's like their features are kind of like well um, well adapted to spreading to lots of different kinds of cultures and scenarios and geographic areas. And Christians are explicit about doing that. The Apostle Paul says he wants to be all things to all people so that he might save as many as possible. But Shinto it looks kind of importantly different, and probably has this in common with lots of indigenous religions, is that it's about this particular place, and you might have to go to some work to separate it from that particular place. Okay, so Izanami and Izanagi gave birth to additional kami. So these again are just kind of spirits or deities. One of those was Amaterasu, and that's the sun goddess. Usually, this is another weird thing about Shinto, is that usually the sun is male, but in this case it's female, and the moon god is male, which again is weird. Usually the moon is a female god. So Amaterasu sends her grandson to bring order to Japan, and then from that grandson came Jimmu. Again, y'all forgive me for interpretational stuff here. I mean, sorry for pronunciation. I'm not going to be good at it. Maybe sometimes I'll get close. And Jimmu was the first human emperor of Japan. This is really important, y'all. This explains so much about Shinto, so much about Japanese use of Shinto, and just even explains so much of the way history has gone. And we'll talk about that. But this claim that the first human emperor of Japan came ultimately from the sun goddess is incredibly important. It means that the emperor is divine, for one thing. Okay, so here's some notable features. And again, I kind of got ahead of myself here. Some notable features, kind of general features of this mythology. So the creation comes about from bringing order to pre-existent chaos. So in Christian theology, there is a disagreement about this. Just to offset Shinto creation story from another one. And later, after the first and second centuries, a debate arose within Christian theology about whether creation occurred from nothing. So this is called ex nihilo. If you want to spell that, this is not going to be testable, but ex space nihilo. And so that's creation from nothing, right? So if you're familiar with, the Christian church and the way they deal with Genesis, a lot of times people will talk about God creating everything from nothing. And this is a common claim. Now, nothing in the Hebrew scriptures is incompatible with that. But a lot of scholars don't think it's there explicitly in the scriptures. Like I said, Genesis 1 is taken by a lot of scholars to be talking about what happened after there was already something. So that the story starts after there's already some stuff there to work with, and God forms it and creates order from chaos. But then many others have come to think that God did create from nothing. He created matter from non-matter, right? So he created matter from nothing. He brought it into existence. And that's different from, I'm putting this in offset from Shinto here, which is, it doesn't talk about creation from nothing. It talks about ordering a pre-existent stuff, that is chaos. We didn't talk about this explicitly in the story, but there is a concern with purity that arises out of this mythology. And this, again, we'll talk about this later in the lecture. This goes on to be a major theme within Shinto, even now. So the sun goddess, again, what's her name? Amaterasu. They get formed after this happens. Izanami, that's the female kami parent, dies, goes to the spirit world, the underworld, basically. Izanagi, her beau, for lack of a better word, her husband, goes down and tries to get her back, but she's ashamed at her impurity, and he comes back and he's washing himself of the impurity of death. He's just been down to the world of the dead. And as he's washing himself, the sun goddess and the moon god and different kami are created from that as he's washing himself. They're created from that act of washing. But the point being here, he's washing himself of the impurity of death and disease. Okay, so just kind of keep that in your mind for now. That's going to be an important feature in Shinto. We'll get there. Third, I've talked about this, the divine origin of the emperor. Fourth, and this is going to be really important, the earth, and Japan specifically, is home to these kami, these divine spirits. And that's important because it means that humans and deities share the same space and the same realm. Okay, so, and we'll talk about this more too in terms of Shinto practice. Purification rituals, prayers for houses, businesses, even cars. There's this, you might call this a this worldly as opposed to an otherworldly aspect to Shinto. The spirits live and move among us. They animate the things that we use. They animate the places where we move and live. We're sharing not only space but the same realm. And compare that to other religions, or at least other sects of religions, in which the spirits have this distinct spirit realm. Like on some kind of cartoonish versions of Christianity, at least, God and the angels are in heaven in this separate realm, and we're here, and they're apart, wholly distinct from us. Now, that's not actually part of Orthodox Christian theology, but that's the way a lot of Christians do think about it. And Shinto is going to be distinct from that way of thinking about Christianity. The spirit world is this very realm that we live in. We share the space. Okay, I'm going to introduce a definition. Syncretism, that's this word up here. It's when two previously distinct cultures or religions adopt aspects of each other, usually as a result of coming in geographical contact with each other. So over here to the right, I have a picture which is unrelated to Shinto, but this is Jesus, but done in the style of Hindu gods, and in fact done, I think, to imitate Shiva, right, with the four arms. The Sacred Heart of Jesus is part of Catholic theology, and then he has the dot on his forehead too. So I mean, it's a mixing of different elements, right? It's clearly Jesus, but Hindu style. It's clearly the Sacred Heart of Jesus, but he has four arms. There's the flowers at his feet. He's sitting legged. Anyway, so independent example, but to talk about Shinto especially, or specifically, in the 6th century AD, there was a lot of syncretism that happened because Buddhism was brought from China. Not only Buddhism, but Confucianism and lots of aspects of Chinese culture in general was brought from China into Japan. And so the Buddhists saw the kami as forms of Mahayana Buddhists, bodhisattvas. And Japan, so the Buddhists were totally cool kind of adopting various aspects of Shinto as part of Buddhism, and as we'll talk about later on, Shinto adopted lots of aspects of Buddhism. And in fact, the shrines and the temple, the Shinto shrines and the Buddhist temples actually kind of bled into each other, and so much so that sometimes you couldn't tell which was which. But Shinto shrines would have Buddhist places of worship, and Buddhist temples would have Shinto shrines within them. This is generally just a time when Japan was importing lots of Chinese culture, writing, Chinese architecture, Chinese poetry. Writing, I don't think Japan had a system of writing before that. Ceramics, art, philosophy, cuisine, tons of stuff. In fact, the name Shinto comes from the Chinese word for this. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but Shinto is how it gets pronounced in Japanese. eventually it got to be where there was kind of a division of religious labor, so to speak, right? So Shinto did some parts of life, and Buddhism was kind of more about other parts of life. So they kind of split up what they were going to deal with. And Shinto was more about agriculture and fertility and birth, and Buddhism was about dealt with philosophy, illness, funerals, afterlife. You might sense a theme there, right? Shinto, and we'll talk more about this later, is kind of going to be more silent on illness and death, and more celebratory of birth and fertility and life and newness and cleanness. And Buddhism, as we've seen, has a lot to say about death and illness and suffering. And so it's kind of a natural division of labor there. That all kind of happened from the 6th century and kind of continued up until the 19th century, when Shinto kind of was forced to make itself distinct. And we'll talk a little bit more about this on later slides, or I think on the next slides. Yep, on the next slide. In the 19th century, during this Westernizing government called the Meiji, again, probably butchering that pronunciation, government. Okay, let's talk about that. So this is actually what the movie, if you've seen the movie The Last Samurai, again, I don't know exactly how historically accurate it is, but this is what it's supposed to be about. If you haven't seen the movie, it's actually pretty good, I think. You should watch it. It's one of Tom Cruise's better things, I think. And it's about how he's an officer from the Civil War. I think he fought for the Union, and then he also fought Indians in America after that, I think. Maybe before, but I think after. And he's this sort of jaded drunk, basically, and he's brought over to Japan ultimately by the emperor with a bunch of other Americans to train their military in Western military tactics and tradition and discipline and all of that. So that part is all roughly accurate. That all of that actually happened, not with Tom Cruise, obviously. So they actually, at this time, during started in 1868, I think. Yeah, well, Emperor Meiji came to the throne in 1868, and he wanted to Westernize Japan. Over Japan's history, the past couple 300 years, they've been in constant, like, loose contact with the West, but they had been very averse. Japan, over its history, has had lots of periods of being very closed off from the West, especially, but even from the outside world. And up until, Emperor Meiji came along, they had, kind of had some contact with the West, but they were deliberately closing it out. They wanted to preserve their culture. And Meiji came along and said that he wanted to Westernize. And so he brought in Western military people, education specialists. He wanted to conform Japan's not only their military, not only their education, but also government, and I'm sure lots of other things, to kind of Western models, right? So people started shooting rifles. They started wearing kind of Western military outfits. They started conforming to Western education models. And the government changed, right? And I'm not going to go into all the specifics of how that happened, but one huge thing that happened in terms of the importance for Shinto is in 1882, Shinto became a state religion. Why did that happen? Well, broadly speaking, because they wanted to, while the Westernizing was happening, they still wanted to preserve Japanese national identity. So they made Shinto, which was a deeply Japanese religion, the state religion. And that meant it got government support and financial support. And even the priests were government employed. They were, paid by the government. So this whole process of guarded Westernization, you might call it, was called the Meiji Restoration. And that kind of lasted the state sanctioning and supporting of Shinto lasted until the end of World War II. Basically, what happened is Shinto ended up, for better or worse, playing into World War II as kind of especially for basically the 2 or 3 decades before World War II and up through World War II, Shinto was essentially functioning as I don't even know how to say this. It was being used to kind of build up support for the Japanese military machine, essentially. So one thing that developed is a kind of warrior code called Bushido, which I guess goes all the way back to the samurai. So it wasn't really part of the state's Shinto system originally, but it definitely got harnessed. And in your book, they even talk about the kind of influence of Shinto belief and practice on the Kamikaze pilots. So they were blessed by Shinto priests. If you don't know what Kamikaze pilots are, they were fighter pilots in World War II, Japanese fighter pilots, who would deliberately fly their planes into ships and things like that, American or whatever ships, and blow themselves up in the process of harming this ship and whoever was on it. I think that we hear about them a lot. I don't think they were all that common, and I don't think they were very effective. Like ships were not like, it's not like if you crash your plane into an aircraft carrier, it's just going to sink it. That's just not how it worked. I think it was more of a desperation move towards the end of the war. At any rate, these pilots, they would, you can find videos of this on YouTube. They would, have this ceremony as they were getting into the plane. They knew it wasn't this thing they decided as they were crashing, whatever. They were going out to crash their planes into the ship, and they would have this ceremony, and they would drink sake, and the Shinto priest would bless them or whatever. And Shinto definitely played into the Japanese war effort, if for no other reason than that the kind of worship of the emperor as a deity really kind of undergirded their loyalty to the government and to the emperor ultimately. And so, seeing that, the Allies, when they came in and had defeated Japan, they basically outlawed Shinto as a state religion. So they said you have to be a secular government. That's one of the terms of your surrender. Secular government in the sense that you can't basically take sides on religion and support a state religion. So Shinto is still very common there, and it's still very much part of the national identity, but it's no longer, since 1945, I guess, possibly 46, no longer a state religion. Okay, let's get back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so let's talk about some Shinto beliefs, and then we're gonna wrap it up. Hold on. I'm gonna check my thing real quick. It still looks like it's recording sound, so I think I'm good. So we're gonna hit on 3 major beliefs, or kind of belief sets. One is that kami are everywhere in the natural world. They animate and explain various natural phenomena like fires, waterfalls, oceans, mountains, and trees. Importantly, there are lots of religions in which this is so, but in Shinto, it's important that they're personal spirits and deities, right? It's not just like the spirit of the waterfall in some loose sense, but the kami actually have names and kind of personalities. There are kami for particularly cunning animals like foxes and badgers, and even dead ancestors become kami. So they're everywhere in the natural world. We are kind of walking amongst them, and they are amongst us. So this goes back to the point of Shinto being very much a religion in which the supernatural and the natural are kind of intertwined and kind of in sharing the same space in the same realm and kind of interacting a lot. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. I mean, even this whole distinction between natural and supernatural might be a product of, Western assumptions, right? The Shinto practitioners might say, yeah, we don't really recognize that distinction. There is no natural apart from the supernatural, or there is no supernatural apart from the natural. These things are just closely intertwined. Okay, two, there is this, what you might call, this is my term, this is the best way I could sum it up. It does seem to sum up a lot of aspects of Shinto, a this world optimism about human life. So as opposed to, again, I think this is a very cartoonish version of Christianity. I don't think it's true Christianity, but you can imagine there were probably periods in which it was a popular belief that this present world is kind of worthless, and what we're doing is we're just trying to make it through, suffer through, until we can get to the next life. And the next life will not even happen in this world. It will happen in heaven, and heaven is this separate realm from the material world, and we'll exist as disembodied spirits. That's actually, we'll talk more about this when we get to our section on Christianity and even Judaism, but it's actually not the biblical story at all. But comparing Shinto to that is going to help us, to that sort of cartoonish version of Christianity. It's going to stand in stark contrast. As opposed to waiting on another world, waiting till the next life, Shinto is very much about the present world and the present life, with a great amount of optimism about the value of those things. So humans are fundamentally good. The body is good. Again, compare that to these kind of medieval cartoonish versions of Christianity on which you're just trying to get away from the body, right? You're just waiting until you can be a pure soul. Shinto, body is good, sex is good, and there's no like sense of guilt about that. And more broadly, the earth and all kind of natural ecology is good. So it's a very kind of nature-based religion. And there are lots of movements within Shinto that are kind of what we might call environmentalist sort of movements. So there's even this plays into even the art and the architecture, where shrines are kind of built into natural environments. So there will always often be like groves of trees that are parts of shrines, and the shrines are kind of naturally adorned. They don't have like thick coats of gaudy paint or things like that. And it's kind of more about showcasing the natural wood, things like that. And note how this feature coheres with the first. So if the kami are so deeply tied to the natural world, well, then of course it's this world, right? It's not the next world or the next life or a heavenly realm that's important. It's this world and this life that's important. And if they're deeply tied to the natural world and to the trees and the mountains and things like that, of course those things have some special significance and importance and value. Okay, finally, I don't know if y'all have heard of this book. I heard about this a few years ago. You might not have heard of it, but it's very, very popular. Again, you can see right here, it's #1 New York Times bestseller, 2 million copies sold. The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, The Japanese Art of Decluttering and Organizing by Marie Kondo. She's got some, so obviously she's a Japanese woman. What does she say? She has some phrases that are so funny. Is this life-giving or something like that? So it's very much, it's almost like a minimalist thing, where she's kind of like helping people declutter and kind of organize their living spaces and working spaces in ways that I guess are supposed to be, better, more healthy or something. I don't know. I haven't read the book. I'm just going to say it. But I didn't realize was this before I studied Shinto, but this can be seen as like very clearly coming out of this Japanese culture, which has been deeply influenced by Shinto, and Shinto, which has been deeply influenced by the Japanese culture. And of course, as it's presented, this is kind of a book that really could only come out of Japan, right? The way that the things are presented, at least. So in Shinto, my ultimate point is this: there are all of these practices surrounding death and illness and things that are related to death, illness, dirtiness, impurity, and lots of Shinto practice and belief. So first of all, like I said, Shinto is much more focused on birth and fertility and life and death is not really a primary focus. And that's, as we said, that was sort of like the Buddhist realm as they split up. these sort of concerns. But there are lots, but as I also said, there are lots of like purification processes. It goes all the way back to the mythology, as we said at the beginning. The mythology that kind of relates to purifying yourself of death and illness and the impurities associated with death. And that translates in Shinto into part of the everyday practice where you purify yourself in lots of different ways. So it goes from the abstract of purifying yourself spiritually and even ethically. Your sort of the ethics that flows out of Shinto are all kind of portrayed in purity terms. We have to be pure by fulfilling our obligations and apologizing when we're wrong and things like that. That's how you maintain your kind of your personal or spiritual purity. But it actually is not just in these abstract spiritual terms. It gets down to the very process of physically cleaning. Everything needs to always be clean and bright, right? These Shinto temples or shrines get rebuilt even like every 20 years or something like this. I mean, I guess it's going to differ, right? But they get rebuilt far more frequently than, for example, a church or a house or a place of business. And everything is kept very clean and pure, quote unquote. And all of that goes back to, again, you can see the association between even physical dirtiness and death, right? I mean, it's kind of a loose association, but there is a clear association there. I mean, why do we wash our hands before we eat? Well, we don't want to get sick, right? Well, why don't we want to get sick? Well, I mean, if you get sick, your body is being broken down, kind of moved closer to death. Sickness might actually kill you, but you're certainly moving in the direction of death. And sicknesses are the sorts of things that can lead to death. And so there are all of these practices, physically cleaning, but even just spiritually purifying oneself that are part of Shinto. And that's sort of, was kind of eye-opening to me, realizing that that's where Marie Kondo is coming from. It's this Japanese culture that has arisen around this, of keeping things very sparse and clean and bright, which ultimately goes back. Isn't that crazy that a New York Times bestseller about cleaning your house up goes back to a sun or a moon god ritually purifying himself of death after he visits his wife in the underworld. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop for now. Hopefully that's not too long, and hopefully Blackboard got the sound on this. All right, I'll see y'all soon.